7 legends of the NBA all watched Caitlin Clark and arrived at a very similar conclusion. Nobody coordinated those opinions. Nobody handed them talking points or asked them to promote her. They simply saw what she was doing on the court, and their basketball instincts wouldn't allow them to ignore it. These are Hall of Famers who spent their lives recognizing greatness before everyone else catches up. And when they speak about a player this strongly, people pay attention. One of those legends, Magic Johnson, actually deserves 2 separate spots in this conversation. Why? Because the things he said about Clark came from 2 completely different angles. One focused on her cultural impact, while the other centered purely on basketball production and numbers. Those points will make more sense later on, but first it's important to understand what each Hall of Famer specifically saw in her game and why their words carry weight coming from them. First up is Kevin Garnett, and honestly, he might be the perfect place to begin because of the type of competitor he was throughout his career. KG never built a reputation as someone who throws around compliments just to be polite. During his 21 seasons in the NBA, he played with a level of intensity that could overwhelm teammates and opponents alike. Everything with Garnett was about effort, toughness, and obsession with winning. He expected complete commitment from everybody around him, and if you didn't match that energy, he had no problem letting you know. That's what makes his comments about Caitlin Clark stand out so much. This isn't a retired player trying to stay connected to the modern game by praising younger stars. Garnett has always spoken exactly how he feels, whether people agree with him or not. So when he openly called Caitlin Clark one of his 2 favorite players to watch in all of basketball, that statement hit differently, not just the WNBA. All of basketball. Think about that for a second. This is coming from a man who won an NBA championship, earned Defensive Player of the Year honors, and spent decades competing against some of the greatest athletes the sport has ever seen. Garnett didn't hesitate when placing Clark in that category. There were no disclaimers attached to it. And interestingly enough, the things he admired most had nothing to do with television ratings, sold-out arenas, or social media attention. What impressed Garnett was the way she controls a game mentally. He kept talking about her creativity, her instincts, and the natural flow she plays with. He described her style almost like improvisation, seeing openings before defenses even realize they exist, the hesitation dribbles that completely stop defenders in place, the passes threaded through impossible angles, the ability to create offense before anyone else on the floor even recognizes the opportunity. One word Garnett repeatedly used was orchestrating. That word matters. Players from Garnett's era viewed point guards differently. To them, the position wasn't only about scoring, it was about controlling tempo, reading every movement on the floor, and directing the entire offense like a conductor leading an orchestra. So when someone with KG's basketball background says Clark reminds him of that style of floor general, it's not random praise. It's a detailed evaluation from someone who spent years studying elite guards up close. Remember, Garnett competed in an era that featured point guards like Isaiah Thomas, Gary Payton, and Jason Kidd. He understands what elite court vision actually looks like. So when he compares Clark's approach to that older style of playmaking, he's speaking from experience very few people can match. But maybe the most overlooked thing Garnett said had nothing to do with her talent at all. It was his reaction to the physical treatment Clark received during the start of her WNBA career. The hard fouls, the aggressive defense, the controversial hit from Chennedy Carter that sparked non-stop debate online. While fans argued over whether Clark was being unfairly targeted, Garnett saw it from a completely different perspective. According to KG, when players put a target on your back, that says everything. He explained it simply. When opponents come after you that aggressively, it usually means they already understand how dangerous you are. In Garnett's eyes, the attention Clark receives isn't disrespect, it's acknowledgement. It's the league reacting to a player everyone knows they have to stop. That's the language of fear, Garnett explained, not hate, fear. Coming from Kevin Garnett, that distinction matters. Few players understood intimidation better than he did. For years, opposing teams designed entire defensive systems around slowing him down. He experienced firsthand what happens when competitors feel threatened by someone they can't control. In his mind, players don't go beyond the line against someone they don't respect. They only do that when a player genuinely worries them. To Garnett, the extra physicality surrounding Caitlin Clark was proof of how seriously opponents already viewed her impact. Hall of Famer number 2 is Shaquille O'Neal, and his perspective might be the most fascinating of all because his game could not have been more different from Clark's. Shaq dominated basketball through sheer size, power, and force. At 7'1", he overwhelmed defenders physically in ways the sport had rarely seen before. Everything about his style revolved around strength and interior dominance. Caitlin Clark, meanwhile, controls games through vision, timing, shooting range, and decision-making from the perimeter. Their basketball identities are complete opposites. That's why Shaq's comments stood out so much. Since retiring, O'Neal has never been someone who carefully tiptoes around his opinions. Whether he's on television, doing interviews, or discussing sports casually, he says exactly what he believes. He doesn't usually spend much time breaking down women's college basketball either, which made his reaction to Clark impossible to ignore. After Clark exploded for 49 points against Michigan during her senior season at Iowa, the performance that pushed her past the all-time women's NCAA scoring record before eventually surpassing Pete Maravich's historic total overall, Shaq didn't hesitate. He flat out called her the greatest women's college basketball player ever. No qualifiers, no debate in his mind, just a direct statement from one of the biggest personalities in basketball history. Charles Barkley immediately pushed back, which is classic Barkley. He questioned whether Clark's resume could truly top legends like Maya Moore, Cheryl Miller, or Diana Taurasi. Barkley pointed to championships, dominance across multiple seasons, and the complete body of work those players built during their careers. And honestly, his argument wasn't unreasonable. Maya Moore helped build a dynasty at UConn. Cheryl Miller transformed women's basketball long before today's spotlight existed. Diana Taurasi became the definition of winning at both the college and professional levels. Clark never captured a national title at Iowa, so there are fair comparisons to make. But Shaq never backed away from his opinion. What makes that important isn't simply the statement itself, it's who the statement came from. A player whose entire career was built around power and physical dominance openly recognized greatness in someone who wins in the exact opposite way. Shaq saw value in Clark's intelligence, shooting ability, pace, and control of the game, even though none of those things resembled his own style. That kind of respect across completely different basketball worlds only happens when talent becomes impossible to deny. Hall of Famer number 3 is Charles Barkley, and his stance on Caitlin Clark has probably been the most layered and controversial of them all. Unlike Shaq, Barkley did challenge the idea that Clark is automatically the greatest women's college player ever. He approached it from a historical perspective, and there's substance behind his reasoning. Before Clark entered the conversation, many people viewed Maya Moore as the gold standard because of her championships and complete skill set. Others pointed to Cheryl Miller's influence on the sport or Diana Taurasi's ability to dominate at every level for years. Barkley wasn't dismissing Clark, he was simply arguing that history deserves context. But where Barkley became one of Clark's loudest supporters was in the bigger cultural conversation surrounding her arrival in the WNBA. Over and over again, Barkley criticized the negative reactions from some players and personalities around the league. He openly said that parts of the WNBA were acting petty toward Clark and the attention she brought into the sport. His argument was straightforward. Clark's presence increased visibility, television ratings exploded, media coverage expanded, sponsorship money grew, charter flights became a reality. More people started paying attention to women's basketball than ever before. In Barkley's view, that level of impact should have been welcomed, not resented. And when Charles Barkley says something publicly, people know it usually comes from exactly what he believes. He's never built his reputation on protecting narratives or saying the safe thing to avoid criticism. That's part of why his comments carried so much weight. To Barkley, the league didn't lose anything because Caitlin Clark became popular. It gained opportunities that players had been fighting for over decades. Charles Barkley has built his entire reputation on saying exactly what he believes, even when people don't want to hear it. That's why his comments about Caitlin Clark carried so much attention. He wasn't defending her because he suddenly became some over-the-top fan. He looked at the situation objectively and came to a conclusion that, in his eyes, was impossible to ignore. The very people benefiting the most from the spotlight Clark brought to the WNBA were also some of the same people making her transition into the league more difficult. To Barkley, that made no sense. At one point during the debate, he even agreed publicly with comments LeBron James had made about the situation. Barkley essentially said the league should appreciate what Clark had done for women's basketball instead of turning her into a target. His argument was simple but powerful. The WNBA in 2024 and 2025 had more attention, more financial momentum, more media coverage, and more mainstream relevance than ever before, and a huge part of that growth traced directly back to one player. Barkley believed that treating Clark like an enemy instead of embracing her as an opportunity showed a complete misunderstanding of what was happening around the league. What makes Barkley's perspective stand out is how balanced it actually is. At no point does he blindly exaggerate Clark's accomplishments. He'll openly tell you that he does not rank her as the greatest women's college basketball player ever. He'll bring up names like Maya Moore, Diana Taurasi, and Cheryl Miller and explain why their resumes deserve that level of respect historically. But then, in the very same conversation, he'll turn around and criticize the hostility surrounding Clark's rise to fame. Both viewpoints can exist at the same time. That's what makes Barkley's take more credible than many of the louder voices. Surrounding the discussion, he's defending Clark where he believes she deserves. Defending while also refusing to rewrite basketball history just because she became a massive star. That combination of honesty and consistency is rare in sports media. Hall of Famer number 4 is Magic Johnson, and his perspective may be the most unique because he has personally experienced the exact type of situation Caitlin Clark is dealing with. When comedian Jimmy Kimmel compared Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese to the WNBA version of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, Magic didn't brush the idea aside. Instead, he leaned into the comparison and explained why the parallel actually made sense. And unlike many people commenting from the outside, Magic knows exactly what it feels like to enter a league with overwhelming attention already attached to your name. Back in 1979, Magic and Larry Bird arrived in the NBA carrying enormous hype. They brought fresh energy, national media attention, and new audiences to professional basketball. But while fans embraced them quickly, not every veteran player did. Magic explained that established stars tested them constantly. There was resentment, extra physicality, constant attempts to prove that popularity had not yet been earned through accomplishments at the professional level. Older players wanted them to understand that attention from the media did not automatically make them the best players in the league. According to Magic, Clark is experiencing that exact reality now. He pointed out something important. Caitlin Clark may have become the biggest attraction in the WNBA almost immediately, but that does not automatically mean she's already the league's top player. Magic understood the difference because he lived through it himself. When he and Bird first entered the NBA, they weren't considered the best players yet, either. They were simply the most talked about players, and the established superstars of that era made sure they felt that distinction every single night. Magic's advice to Clark was honest and direct. At some point, popularity alone stops mattering. Eventually, the game itself has to speak, louder than the attention surrounding you. He acknowledged that players like Aja Wilson, Breanna Stewart, and Nafisa Collier had already built stronger professional resumes inside the WNBA. And in his eyes, there was only one way for Clark to fully close that gap: continue improving and prove it consistently on the court. That's what made Magic's comments so valuable. He wasn't simply complimenting Clark because she was famous or exciting to watch. He gave her genuine respect while also being truthful about where she currently stood among the league's elite players. That kind of honesty usually only comes from someone who has already survived the same pressures himself. That's the difference between empty praise and genuine respect. When someone is willing to be fully honest about your situation, it usually means they take your talent seriously. Hall of Famer number 5 is Isaiah Thomas, and few people in basketball history understand point guard play better than he does. Thomas wasn't just a great guard, he was the engine behind 2 Detroit Pistons championships, a 1-2-time NBA All-Star, and one of the rare players who dominated offensively while also disrupting games defensively at an elite level. He understands the position from the inside because he spent his career controlling games with the ball in his hands against the best competition in the world. So when Isaiah Thomas talks about a point guard, people listen carefully. When he discussed Caitlin Clark, he kept coming back to one phrase: the it factor. At first glance, that might sound like a vague compliment, but coming from Thomas, it means something much deeper. He wasn't talking about raw talent. Every professional player has talent. What Thomas meant was the rare ability to dictate everything happening on the floor, controlling tempo, manipulating defensive reactions, and forcing the game to unfold on your terms, instead of the opponent's. To Thomas, the true greats at point guard don't just play within the system, they bend the entire game around themselves. That idea became even more interesting when Brendan Sewell, a two-time NBA championship assistant coach who worked directly with Thomas in Detroit, added his own observations about Clark's game. Sewell pointed out two skills that immediately stood out to him: Clark's movement without the basketball and the way she weaponizes screens to create chaos for defenses. According to Sewell, those traits reminded him of strategies the Pistons used with Isaiah Thomas during his career. Whenever defenses overloaded pick and roll coverage to trap Thomas, Detroit would shift him off the ball because defenders struggled to contain elite guards constantly moving through screens and changing angles. Isaiah himself agreed with the comparison. What impressed him most was Clark's understanding of defensive pressure away from the ball. She recognizes where defenders are leaning, anticipates rotations before they happen, and slips into open space at exactly the right moment. Thomas viewed that as one of the defining differences between good point guards and truly elite ones. Not shooting range, not flashy passing, but the ability to punish defenses even when you aren't handling the ball yourself. One possession during Clark's 2024 season against the Connecticut Sun perfectly captured what Thomas was describing. While Kelsey Mitchell attacked from the top of the floor in a pick and roll, Connecticut's defense collapsed toward the paint to contain the drive. At the same time, Clark sprinted along the weak side baseline through a staggered double screen. The important part wasn't simply the movement itself, it was the timing. Clark had already recognized where the help defense was rotating before Mitchell fully committed to the drive. She used the second screen to redirect into open space near the left elbow just as the defense shifted away from her. By the time Connecticut's perimeter defender recovered from chasing her through traffic, it was already too late. Clark caught the pass, squared up instantly, and released the shot before the contest could even arrive. Bucket. The breakdown happened long before the shot went up. Clark manipulated the defense without ever needing the ball in her hands. That's the exact type of control Isaiah Thomas meant when he talked about the it factor. Hall of Famer number 6 brings us back to Shaquille O'Neal, because beyond calling Clark an all-time great collegiate player, he also highlighted something much more technical that deserves attention: her release speed. Shaq referenced a stat that analysts had tracked closely: Clark's shot release averaging around 0.43 seconds. That may sound like a small detail, but in basketball terms, it's massive. Shaq didn't mention it casually. He brought it up because players who spent years competing at the highest level understand how dangerous a shooter becomes when defenders don't even have time to react properly. Throughout his career, Shaq constantly watched teams structure defenses around elite perimeter shooters. He knew exactly how quickly one moment of hesitation could turn into 3 points. And his observation lined up closely with something Stephen Curry, another player, almost guaranteed to become a first ballot Hall of Famer, one day has also pointed out about Clark. Her release mechanics are incredibly similar to his. That matters because Curry completely changed basketball with the speed and efficiency of his shooting motion. Defenders can play perfect coverage for most of a possession, but if they lose track of him for even a split second, the shot is already gone. Clark creates that same kind of pressure. The speed of her release doesn't just help her make shots, it changes the geometry of the defense itself, because opponents know they cannot afford even the smallest mistake tracking her movement. A release time of just 0.43 seconds changes everything for a defender. By the moment a defender's brain recognizes that Caitlin Clark has started her shooting motion and sends the signal to react, the ball is already gone. That's why her shot is so difficult to contest consistently. At that speed, athleticism alone isn't enough to recover. The only real option is preventing her from catching the ball in the first place. But that creates another problem entirely. When defenses overcommit to denying Clark touches, they open driving lanes, passing angles, and breakdowns elsewhere on the floor. Her shooting range and release speed force defenses into impossible choices before the possession even fully develops. Shaquille O'Neal understands that kind of pressure better than almost anyone. He's not known as a shooting technician or a perimeter mechanics expert, and he'd probably be the first person to admit that. But Shaq spent his entire career being a nightmare matchup for opposing defenses. He knows what it feels like when opponents simply run out of answers. That's what he recognized in Clark. The same helplessness defenders once felt trying to stop him near the basket now exists in a completely different form with Clark's shooting. In both cases, the defense often realizes what's happening too late to stop it. Hall of Famer number 7 brings us back to Magic Johnson for a second time, because another comment he made deserves its own spotlight entirely. Earlier, Magic focused on the cultural side of Clark's rise, comparing her experience to the attention and resistance he and Larry Bird dealt with entering the NBA. But his second observation was much more specific, and honestly, it may be the most important thing any Hall of Famer has said about her game. During her rookie season, Caitlin Clark became only the 4th player in professional basketball history to record over 500 points and 200 assists in fewer than 30 games. The other 3 names on that list: Oscar Robertson, Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas. Every one of them is a Hall of Fame point guard and a foundational figure in basketball history. That's what made Magic's reaction so significant. He wasn't speaking hypothetically, he wasn't offering praise just to be supportive. He simply acknowledged the reality of the numbers and recognized that Clark had entered statistical territory occupied by some of the greatest playmakers the sport has ever seen, including himself. And there's an important distinction there. Magic never claimed Clark had already reached his level as a player. That wasn't his point. What he emphasized was that the blend of scoring and playmaking she displayed so early in her professional career placed her in historically elite company. That's not marketing. That's not hype. That's data. Out of everything Magic said about Clark, this may have been the strongest endorsement of all, because it came directly from measurable production rather than opinion. The fact that a Hall of Famer looked at a category containing his own name and publicly acknowledged that a 22-year-old rookie belonged beside it says a lot about how unusual Clark's start has been. And when you step back and look at the full picture, what becomes fascinating is how 7 completely different basketball minds all identified greatness in completely different ways. Kevin Garnett saw the competitive pressure Clark creates and interpreted the physical treatment she received as fear from opponents rather than simple hostility. Shaquille O'Neal, whose dominance came through overwhelming size and strength, recognized an entirely different form of unstoppable offense in Clark's shooting, mechanics, and lightning-fast release. Charles Barkley approached the situation with the most balanced defending Clark against what he viewed as unfair resistance while still refusing to exaggerate her historical resume beyond what he believed the record supports. Magic Johnson connected Clark's experience to his own journey entering the NBA, understanding both the benefits and challenges that come with becoming the face of a league before fully establishing yourself as its best player. Isaiah Thomas analyzed her from the perspective of pure point guard mastery, focusing on the advanced off-ball movement and game control that separate elite floor generals from merely talented guards. And Brendan Sewell, the longtime assistant coach who helped build championship teams, alongside Thomas in Detroit, added another layer of technical detail that reinforced exactly why Clark's movement patterns create so many impossible situations for defenses, different eras, different personalities, different basketball philosophies, yet all of them arrived at the same conclusion in their own way. Caitlin Clark is doing things that demand attention from people who truly understand the game. Both Isaiah Thomas and Brendan Sewell ended up identifying the exact same trait in Caitlin Clark's game. Two basketball minds shaped by championship experience looked at her movement, her timing, and her understanding of space and came to the same conclusion about what separates her from most players. Then there's Shaquille O'Neal's second major point, the technical side of her shooting. Mechanics. Shaq used Clark's lightning-fast release time as proof of why defenders struggle to contain her. Coming from arguably the most dominant interior scorer of his era, that observation carried real weight. He understood that unstoppable offense doesn't always look the same. In his career, dominance came through physical power. With Clark, it comes through speed, anticipation, and the fact that defenses often react a split second too late. And then there's Magic Johnson's second perspective, which may have been the strongest statement of all, because it relied purely on historical numbers. Magic publicly acknowledged that Clark's early professional production placed her in statistical company with Oscar Robertson, Isaiah Thomas, and himself, not as hype, not as marketing, simply as a factual reality based on the record books. That matters, because when a player whose name is permanently attached to basketball history openly recognizes another player entering that territory, people listen differently. Think about the bigger picture here. 7 Hall of Famers, more than 100 combined years of elite basketball experience, players who competed against legends, won championships, controlled dynasties, and helped define entire eras of the sport. None of them had any obligation to speak this strongly about a WNBA player still early in her professional career. There was no coordinated campaign, no shared business interest, no reason to force the conversation. They spoke because they saw something impossible to ignore. And despite their completely different personalities and basketball philosophies, every one of them arrived at the same conclusion in their own way. Caitlin Clark is legitimate, not because of hype, not because of media attention, because her game demanded respect from people who understand basketball at the highest possible level. That's what makes this different from ordinary praise. When Hall of Famers repeatedly bring up your name without being prompted, when competitors who spent decades studying greatness feel compelled to talk about what they're watching, that recognition means something statistics alone can't fully explain. 7 basketball legends saw it early. And after 2 seasons, the rest of the WNBA has seen enough evidence to understand why they did.